What will the role of bishops be in the Global Methodist Church? That's the question we are discussing today at Theology Project. My name is Matt O'Reilly. I serve as lead pastor at Christ Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which is a Global Methodist congregation. And my guest today is Bishop Scott Jones, who is one of two working bishops in the newly formed Global Methodist Church. Bishop Jones was elected as a bishop in the United Methodist Church in 2004, transitioned into the Global Methodist Church, and was recognized as a bishop earlier this year. Is that right?
That's right.
In January. He holds a Ph.D. from Southern Methodist University, where he did work on John Wesley's understanding of Scripture and how that relates to the way we interpret Scripture as the people in the Wesleyan tradition. Author of multiple books, popular level, scholarly level, married to Mary Lou. You have three children, and I had the pleasure of meeting Mary Lou at annual conference just a week or two ago, and I was grateful for that. Bishop Jones, welcome to Theology Project.
Thank you, Matt. I'm glad to be in conversation with you and through you with all the people who'll be watching this video.
I'm excited. Just give us a chance to get to know you a little bit. So not all bishops are trained theologians. I mean, all bishops offer theological leadership, for better or worse. But you've done advanced work, and you've written theological works on John Wesley in his historical setting in relation to the way we think about the Bible. You know that the pastor-theologian vocation is a part of my own sense of vocation and passion. Talk to us a little bit about, help us get to know you. What does it mean to be a bishop who is also a working theologian?
Well, Matt, it really goes back to my encounter with Wesley, the second semester of my seminary degree, where I sat under Albert Outler for a semester, and it was like Roberta Flack. He was telling my life with his words, strumming my fate with his fingers, killing me softly with his song. When I listened to Outler describe Wesley, I said, that's me. But nobody had ever talked to me about that. I had not learned what it means to be a Methodist Christian growing up, even though my father was a pastor and a seminary president. Well, that sort of gave me a vocation to make sure that as much as possible, I helped other people learn what it means to be a Wesleyan Christian. So I went straight from the MDiv program into the Ph.D. program, did that full time for a few years, then became a pastor. I love being a pastor. Those were some of the best years of my life in a little town called Prosper, Texas, that had 1,000 people. I quit working on the dissertation. And eventually, my staff parish chair said, you have got to graduate. And so I went back into work on the dissertation, got it done after 11 years in the PhD program. Meanwhile, I was teaching adjunct at Perkins School of Theology. And so all my ministry, I was combining both being a pastor and a teacher. My spiritual gift is teaching, but it's really part of this larger vocation to help Wesleyans know who they are and understand what it means to follow Jesus in the Wesleyan tradition. As a bishop, I lost my capacity to do solid academic work. There's just not time.
Sure.
I've been invited to read papers at academic gatherings, and I said, I can't do it justice. But I'm leveraging what I've learned over the years, and I'm writing a book right now on grace. And so for a popular audience, I still have the ability to teach. And I'm back at Baylor University, not back, but I'm back teaching at Baylor University's Truett School of Theology for helping people in their Wesley House of Studies get the theological education they need. So that's my calling. I love being a pastor. I love being a bishop. I love being a theologian and teacher. So God's blessed me by letting me sort of stand in the middle of all those vocations.
That's spectacular. I think we live in a day. So throughout church history, bishops especially were theological shepherds of the church. And maybe this can kind of help us segue into our conversation about the role of bishops in the GMC. But historically, the church has had bishops, and bishops offered like theological leadership. If you go back and read the early church, a lot of the formative documents were written by folks who were working in episcopal roles. And just so everybody's super clear, bishop and episcopal, episcopacy, all those words are kind of interchangeable. But probably a few hundred years ago, pastors and bishops, like when with the rise of the modern university, we sort of outsourced the theological leadership to the academy, and maybe drifted away from seeing bishops as theological shepherds of the church and pastors as theological shepherds of the church. I think we live in a day where American Christianity is kind of recovering that vision. And perhaps the Global Methodist Church can help us with that too, since we have bishops who are hopefully kind of maybe freed up in some ways to be theological leaders. It shifted into more of an administrative role, would you say? Is that how you might characterize your work as a bishop, earlier on?
I think that's absolutely true. And to some extent, it's the same for a pastor in your situation.
Sure.
What is the expectation that your people have of you? Do they expect you to deliver thoughtful, well-researched, academically respectable sermons? Or do they want sort of entertainment preaching on a Sunday morning? In the same way, I think the United Methodist Church morphed bishops into an administrative role, and the whole system set up expectations for me for 18 years of that kind of leadership, so that there was a time when I was supervising 17 district superintendents and 6 professional conference staff.
Wow.
That's more than any business leader ought to be supervising. And so the expectations were such that that was what was moving my time and my energy.
So now, go ahead, sorry.
Well, I was just going to move into the Global Methodist Church. In its book of Doctrines and Disciplines, says that it expects bishops to be spiritual leaders and teachers of the faith, to guard and transmit the apostolic faith. Well, at the moment, I'm supervising nobody. I have no direct reports. I'll explain a little bit later that I do relate to some other leaders in a supervisory way, but I don't have any staff meetings. Now, it's also true that I don't have an assistant or secretary, so that when I'm signing ordination certificates and putting my gold seal on them, it's me and Mary Lou who are providing that work. And there are days I wish I had a secretary.
Yeah. So let's frame it this way. So folks are coming out of the United Methodist Church into the Global Methodist Church, and one of the most important questions is, what will the role of bishop be? But even before that, some folks are saying, should we even have bishops? Because I think there's a sense of like, here's a system that we're coming out of because we think there were some unhealthy patterns, various ways. Don't want to get heavy into that. We're looking to the future, not the past. But we are formed by the context we've come out of. So talk to us, before we even get into the role specifically, like, biblical theological foundations of the episcopacy. Why are you committed to a church governance structure and polity that includes bishops? Clearly you are. Talk to us about how you got to that place. Like, why does the GMC need bishops? What does scripture say about that? What are the theological arguments there?
Excellent questions, and I could talk for a long time about them. Let me be brief. The New Testament does not have a single form of church organization that's binding on all Christians. Mm-hmm. But there are hints. And one of the hints is that as the apostles were planting churches, in each place there was a leader. There was somebody that the apostles related to, and over time, that person carried out the ministry of oversight. In other words, there's always the chance that heresy will creep in, that personality conflicts will be rising to the top and preventing missional effectiveness. And so there were leaders in each major city, and the title bishop shows up in the New Testament. And so the church, as it developed over time, had these bishops, and the bishops were holding each other accountable, because there was no single authority sort of making sure who could remove bishops and elect bishops. But there was a role that needed to be played for oversight. Now, let me compare that with what I know about modern human organization. Every organization needs a leader. And so that leader plays a crucial role in setting the tone and purpose and function and health of the organization. And so whether it's a corporation in the business world or a university or something else, there are people who lead and who tend to the health of the organization. Well, I think every local church needs to belong to a denomination. And part of the reason for that is that the denomination provides some measure of accountability. I encourage people to listen to the Christianity Today podcast about the Mars Hill Church, a huge congregation that imploded and disappeared in a matter of weeks. Well, the basic answer is Mars Hill needed a bishop. Now, I'm well aware that people have had some bad experiences recently with bishops. And so they jump to the other extreme and say, we don't want any bishops. As a historian, I want to remind people there once was a time when Methodist bishops were useful, when we were a growing denomination. And I think what we're crafting in the Global Methodist Church is that kind of episcopacy.
That's really helpful. It's helpful for me as well. Like if I'm to think of texts, so if we're thinking about scriptural foundations and how we sort of adapt or not adapt, but live into that. So you have texts like in Titus where Paul tells Titus to appoint elders in every town. So it looks like there's Paul giving oversight to Titus, and Titus has some sort of collaborative oversight with churches. Again, that's not like a prescription for all people at all times, but it does look like the New Testament sets us up for some sort of collaborative oversight structure. And so we've learned over time that could go well or it could go badly. The fact that it's possible for it to go badly doesn't mean we should do away with it altogether. It means we should work hard to build healthy systems and structures.
Now, the problem with this is who's going to hold the bishops accountable.
Right.
And so that's a situation that everybody faces who has an Episcopal form of government. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions facing the Global Methodist Church today.
Do we have a sense of what that's going to look like in the Global Methodist Church, bishops' accountability? Not yet.
At the moment, we have a robust system.
Yeah.
I work for the Transitional Leadership Council.
Gotcha.
If you all are upset with my behavior and conduct, you write a letter to the chair of that TLC, who does an investigation, and at the end of the investigation, they can fire me. So there is a level of accountability right now. What will be put in place after the convening general conference has yet to be determined, and part of the reason we're having this conversation on this interview today.
One of the ideas I've heard floated is something like a global episcopacy committee, sort of like a local Global Methodist Church may have a staff parish relations committee that creates accountability for the appointed pastors and staff. And in the UMC, the bishops held each other accountable, which led to some problems. But what's the likelihood that we'll have sort of a potentially a global committee on the episcopacy, clergy, and laity, and that functions a lot like a local church functions to create pastoral accountability? Is that a feasible prospect? Is it a desirable prospect? Are there dangers there that we need to be watching out for?
It is a desirable option. I think it's got real potential. It has its downside because committees have a hard time gaining the strength and backbone to take decisive action. Look, let's be honest. God has decided to use human beings to accomplish his purposes through a church. That's a huge mistake on God's part. I fully intend to tell him that if I make it to heaven, that God, surely you could have found a better way than using fallible, short-sighted, self-interested, sinful human beings. So the chances of a church screwing up, making mistakes, it's always real. And yet, when a church is a movement, when it's focused on its mission, then you make the tough calls and do the right thing. I would also tell you that in the United Methodist Church, bishops did not hold each other accountable. I never experienced that. We were siloed. Each bishop was king or queen in his or her own area, and there were too dang many bishops. Real accountability was to the jurisdictional conference, and so the creation of jurisdictions was a major problem that allowed the United Methodist Church to go off track.
I gotcha. So one of the questions, well, here's I'm going to shift gears a little bit on you, but I think this is something that confuses a lot of people. So in the United Methodist Church, the role of the bishop and the Itineracy, the annual appointment system where pastors are serving at the discretion of the bishop, who has the authority not to move an elder, not even just once a year, but anytime. So the role of the bishop and the Itineracy and the appointment system were all interwoven pretty deeply, but they are distinguishable. So one of the questions that has come to me is people just say, what does it mean to have bishops without the Itineracy? Like, is that even possible? So talk to us a little bit about the difference between the episcopacy, the Itineracy, and the appointment process. The GMC is retaining the episcopacy and a modified appointment process, but we're I think discarding the Itineracy. Help viewers understand those distinctions and what it means for the Global Methodist Church to kind of step into a new or a fresh experience of bishops in that way.
Well, those are important questions, and we are building this bridge as we walk on it. We have some principles. One principle is there is no guaranteed appointment, and so that it's possible that a Global Methodist clergy person could be without a job. Secondly, we have a principle that we want long-term appointments. So we expect each pastor to stay in his or her church for a long time. Thirdly, we really don't intend to yank clergy out unless they're willing to go and unless the church is willing to see them go. Basically, the way to describe it is we're starting to treat all of our congregations the way that bishops have come to treat their largest congregations. So whenever there was a church with worshiping 1,000 or more in my Texas conference years, I met with that staff parish committee personally, and we had a very collaborative way of making that next appointment. Now, one of the goals of episcopacy is accountability, so that I have the right to remove a pastor in any of the conferences I work in. But that's only used in an extreme situation. Most of the time we assume it's going well, but there are times, just like the Mars Hill situation, where an outside leader needs to step in. I'll tell you one story out of the Houston area. There was a church that I was supervising. Pastor had a moral failure. The staff parish committee was kind of surprised to discover they had a bishop. I met with them. And they were like deer in the headlights. This pastor had been there more than 25 years. They loved him, but they knew he had to leave. And what do we do? How do we do this? Committees are notoriously bad at making tough decisions like that. But I stepped in, and with the district superintendent, we got them an interim pastor. Eventually, after 3 months, sent them a new pastor. 2 years later, a man came up to me at annual conference and said, "Bishop, I'm from such and such a church. I was on the committee in the room with you, and I just want to say thank you for guiding us through a difficult time." In other words, that's how I step in when I'm needed. Well, I think that's what the appointive power of the episcopacy does, but it's going to be exercised differently. Rather than assuming that every year somebody's up for reappointment, I expect, as your bishop, Matt, that you're going to be at Christ Church for a really long time. I'm not going to be evaluating, is this Matt's year to move? Now, on the other hand, if you start falling apart or making mistakes or bad things happen, then you're going to hear from me, and we'll have some conversation along with your presiding elder and the president of the North Alabama Conference.
Yep. So it sounds like what we're trying to move away from just a really heavy administrative, like we're moving people around this year, like we do every year, to needed accountability, but really freedom for pastors and churches to grow together, space for long-term fruitfulness. I think a pastor, one pastor colleague of mine who served a church for well over 30 years said to me once, our healthiest churches are the places where the pastors have been able to serve the longest. And so, I mean, have you seen a relationship between pastoral tenure and congregational health?
Yes and no.
Tell us more about that. Good.
Where the pastor is able to reinvent himself or herself as the church grows, that's good.
Yeah.
I've also seen a pastor who was emotionally tied to a certain size, say 150 in worship attendance, who cratered rather than figured out how to grow it to 300 in worship attendance, or from 1,000 to 2,000. You know what I mean?
I do.
And so when the pastor has the gifts to lead it into the next stage, then that works. And so there have been some really long tenured Methodist pastors at our largest growing churches who have been able to lead in that kind of way. And so that's a blessing. And I don't want to go back to the 1800s method of a maximum of 2 years in one appointment, because I think that's artificial. And quite frankly, the mobility of the American public means that sometimes your congregation is changing under you, and stability of leadership is a value.
Yeah. So I think, again, we're in this place where we have the opportunity to do some creative collaboration and visioning around like what healthy long-term pastoral and congregational relationships look like. And my guess is, like, if you're not consumed with selecting the pastors in 500 or more churches every spring, you've got more bandwidth to actually help clergy thrive where they are.
Well, let's be really clear that I supervise 13 annual conferences at the moment.
So maybe not, right?
The real appointive work is being done by presiding elders and presidents pro tem. Yes, I have to fix or make every appointment, but it's the rare situation where I get involved personally in the decision-making process.
Very good. Yeah. So I guess the question then shifts into, if you're not deeply involved in the appointment clergy deployment process, then that does free you up, though, in terms of bandwidth, probably, to be for the teaching office that you didn't have time to do when you had 17 superintendents to supervise, right? So maybe give us a sense of how you envision like a really healthy, like, what does a healthy teaching bishop do with his or her time? And what's that look like?
um, I have just completed 8 annual conferences in 8 weeks. I have 2 weekends off, last weekend and Labor Day weekend, and then I go back into 2 more, and so I'm lots of places. I think the gift I bring, and I hope you experienced this when I was in North Alabama, is that I am teaching and leading by focusing on our values and what God is doing, so that my job is to guard the integrity of the Global Methodist Church by emphasizing the things we care about the most. And whether it's preaching or an Episcopal address, or I'm training presiding elders where I meet with them. I've met with the ordinands before we did the ordination service. Over and over and over, I'm talking about this is what it means to be a Global Methodist Church. This is who we are. And so I just wrote an article for our newsletter. I'm engaged in meetings where our values are being fleshed out. Yeah. And so those are the contributions I make as a spiritual leader and teacher.
Is it fair to say the shift is from management to shepherding? That's
exactly right.
And I would, as a clergy person, I would say that's a much needed shift. That's, I think that's where bishops were largely throughout the history of the church. When the episcopacy was functioning at its best, episcopacy was functioning at its best, bishops were shepherding the church. Yeah. When we moved bishops into more of a management role, then we didn't have shepherds in that way. Yeah. So let's you mentioned 8 annual conferences, and it was fun to have you in North Alabama with us recently. You mentioned while you were with us a distinction. You made a distinction between residential bishops in the UMC and traveling bishops in the tradition of Francis Asbury. We've teased that, I think, a little bit in this conversation, but I want to make sure that folks listening get a chance to really understand that distinction. So talk us through the distinction. What's best in this regard for the Global Methodist Church? I think I know where that's going, but I want to hear it from you. And then maybe like set that out, and then maybe we can look at advantages, disadvantages of, like, if we think traveling bishops is the way to go, like the practicalities, like that's going to cost less, won't it? So just talk to us about that distinction, and then we'll kind of see where it goes.
I'm happy to do that. Our church is governed by the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline, put together by the Transitional Leadership Council. It is the statement of our values and the rules that we're living by. Next year, sometime in the latter 4 months or so, the convening General Conference will meet to affirm what's in that book and make whatever changes need to be there. Embedded in the book are 2 different models of episcopacy right now. One is what's called a residential bishop. It's assumed that that person will have 1 or 2 annual conferences, will be paid by that annual conference, but the book doesn't say how those people will be elected or assigned. Again, there's been sort of preliminary talk that they would be elected at the general conference, but then that's not clear about how you assign them. And will North Alabama get somebody from Indiana who's elected at the general conference and sent to live in Birmingham? Will North Alabama have just 1 bishop, or will Alabama Emerald Coast and you all share a bishop? There are lots of questions to flesh out that residential model. The United Methodist Church and its predecessor, the Methodist Church, had residential bishops. They were required to live in their area. That was a change, and I'll explain the change in a minute. But many times people use the phrase residential bishop, and they don't understand that it was just invented in 1939. and had a specific reaction against some changes in the late 1800s. Okay. The other model embedded in our book is a model for a bishop in case any active bishops left the United Methodist Church and came into the Global Methodist Church. Well, two of us did. Now, there are also three retired ones, but Mark Webb and I volunteered to be available as full-time active bishops in the Global Methodist Church. What that has worked out to be is that we together have divided up the world so that I'm supervising 13 conferences. Mark has the rest, and we are itinerant general superintendents, as you said, traveling bishops. That's very similar to what episcopacy was like throughout the whole of the 1800s. I tell people Francis Asbury started the year in Georgia, rode his horse up the eastern seaboard, got to the New England area and the midsummer, and then rode back down on the west side of the Alleghenies. That was his pattern. In 1811, he held 8 annual conferences. I haven't counted how many camp meetings and revivals and other kinds of meetings he had. When he showed up, he was the bishop and he fixed the appointments. But the day-to-day work was done by the presiding elders. And so this model of episcopacy was effective and it worked. And so that's an option for the Global Methodist Church. There may be a third option or a hybrid or some other way of doing it. But I want the whole church to be talking about what kind of bishops do we want and how can they be selected and assigned. So we could have, if we followed the residential model, 20, 25 bishops, and there would be a bishop resident in Alabama someplace, another one resident in Indiana or Illinois someplace, another one resident in Kentucky or Pennsylvania, and there would be a deeper relationship between that bishop and that conference. That would take 20 or 25 bishops, I think, worldwide. Sure. We've got nearly that many annual conferences forming. And so, but it would shift the funding to that annual conference. So you all in Alabama, either by yourselves or with Alabama Emerald Coast, would pay for your bishop.
Yep. So let me jump in on that just a second. So I think this is one of the really crucial pieces where we've got to work hard on this. We have, for lack of a better word, pitched and sold the Global Methodist Church on lower costs. So in the United Methodist Church, churches paid annual apportionments. Sometimes that's 10%, give or take, depending on the formulas in various places. Right now, I think in North Alabama, churches are paying 2%, but it's like we've gone around the country. GMC leaders have gone around the country saying this is going to cost less. It's going to cost less. If we shift into 25 bishops or so, it's not going to cost less, right? It's like the administrative costs are going to start ratcheting up. Maybe not a lot right away. My fear is we won't be able to keep churches in if that 2% goes to 3%, 4%, 5% over the next 10 years or 15 years, 20 years. Churches aren't going to stay if we don't keep our promise that this is a less expensive overall organization.
I get it. So let's talk about the other option for a minute. If we stay with this itinerant general superintendency, what you call traveling bishops, we might get along. Please God, there have got to be more than 2 of us. Mark and I are just knocking ourselves out. But you could get by with 6, maybe.
Yeah, so that was one of my questions. More than 2, but less than 48, probably, right?
Yeah, and I would assume you've got to have some bishops who are living in other continents, Europe, Africa, Philippines, I don't know. And those would be selected by the General Conference and paid for out of the general church funds. As Mark and I are being paid right now, we're drawing a salary and travel expenses and all that sort of stuff. And so figuring out, now, there are advantages to this, that if you have a group of, say, 6 bishops, it is easier to build a sense of team and mutual accountability among 6 than among 20. And having 6 bishops, you can look each other in the eye and say, what are you thinking? This is crazy. And the peer pressure would help keep the denomination on track. That kind of conversation never happened in the Council of Bishops. Partly you had all the retirees present with voice. Partly, by the time I was elected, the sense was that each bishop had ultimate power in his or her own conferences, and you did not interfere in another bishop's territory. Occasionally there was collaboration in a jurisdiction around some things, and occasionally collaboration did emerge, but there was never a sense of mutual accountability because the Council of Bishops could not force a bishop to behave differently if he or she was out of bounds. Well, I think the Global Methodist Church with a smaller group of bishops could, in fact, create that kind of culture and accountability to, as you said earlier, some committee on episcopacy that had the right to remove bishops when they've aren't functioning well.
Sure. So just to help so that viewers and listeners are super clear, so you relate to in the North Alabama, let's just use the North Alabama Conference as a case study. We have a president pro tem who's a full-time pastor, but it's his responsibility to preside over the annual conference when you're not present with us. So it's not a full, like the president pro tem job is not a full-time position as you know, like a residential bishop in the UMC. And then there's a group of presiding elders who give oversight and help churches and pastors relate, connect, do, like if there's going to be interviews, things like that. So it's not having a residential bishop does not mean we don't have local leadership. So maybe talk to us a little bit about how you relate to the local leadership in an annual conference.
Well, your president pro tem is somebody that I talk to on a regular basis. I also talk to the presiding elders as a group to train them and talk about our values. And we try to have conversations, cross conferences around best practices. So I've been teaching people, just because you change the name on your sign from United to Global doesn't mean you're going to be renewed and revitalized. We've got to get away from the bad habits we've learned and once again reclaim a commitment to evangelism, church planting, youth ministry, children's ministry, cross-racial work around with people of color, and all those things have got to be embedded in our congregations. So that most of what I do with your leadership is not around appointments, but around building a culture that's missionally focused. But when a problem comes up, the president pro tem has got to call me and say, Bishop, what do I do about X or Y? So out of my 13 conferences, I've had a number of situations in these last 8 months that have arisen where I've got to step in and give guidance to the local leadership about how they handle it. So that's, and if there are personality conflicts, sometimes I fly in and meet with the people face to face. But one of the blessings of this part of the 21st century is we've learned how to do these Zoom conversations, and I do most of it from my office here in Dallas, Texas.
Yeah. So I think, well, let me just, that's helpful. So you're really in a lot of ways with freed up to do, again, like the shepherding work. You're thinking about church vitality and energizing missions. And I remember thinking years before the GMC was formed and we had got to the point we are now where churches are populating it, like whatever we wind up with, I want it to be a lean, mean mission machine is what I've told people. Like low overhead as much as possible. You know, we don't need all of the boards and agencies that we have in the United Methodist Church. We have publishers that can produce discipleship resources. We have plenty of independent mission agencies in the Wesleyan tradition and beyond that we can relate to do missions and do it really well. We don't have to reinvent the wheel on those kinds of things. And so, and I think the role of bishops is a really important part of that question, not just in terms of funding it, but in terms of your job description, right? Can we have the Global Methodist Church be a lean, mean mission machine where bishops are the ones who are shepherding us into healthy, vital, evangelistic, disciple-making congregations?
You are describing the vision that I'm trying to live into. Now, how well I do it is a matter of conversation going forward. And we have tough choices about how to actually make that happen, but that certainly is our goal. Let me give you an example around missions. I will teach you and everybody else in North Alabama that the Global Methodist Church in North Alabama needs to have international mission activities, relationships, funding, so that whether it's Christ Church or the whole North Alabama Conference, I'm going to say our value is to be global, and that means we wealthy Americans need to share our wealth, and we need to be open to the influence of our more evangelistic brothers and sisters from Africa who can help us light spiritual fires in our territory. Now, we want decisions made as locally as possible, which means I am never going to give you an assignment that says your church or your conference must build a partnership with X country. But I'm a bishop that includes places in Africa and the Philippines. I know of options so that if you're looking for a mission partnership, I've got some suggestions to make to you. Places I see God at work that you all might want to get involved with. So when I was in a different annual conference, I pitched a partnership with one of our global mission efforts in North Africa. That church is looking seriously at getting involved there. So I'm excited about that kind of matchmaking or facilitating is the better word. I'm not matchmaking. I'm facilitating, helping you all do what you really want to do.
And that to me seems like a much healthier expression of the work of the episcopacy. I think like one of the major fears is, and I know pastors who have joined other Wesleyan denominations because of this fear with churches, is that the GMC will become UMC 2.0. And like we're in a season, and what they mean by that is that we'll sort of bring the institutional weaknesses of the United Methodist Church into the Global Methodist Church because that's all we know or something, right? And so my hope is, and I hope as people hear your vision of the episcopacy, that maybe it will help spark some hope that we're not just going to reproduce the thing we've come out of. But if we shift back into a more like every annual conference has a resident bishop, will that substantiate the fears that we are reproducing the thing we just came out of?
You have probably picked up that I think the better option is the traveling bishop model. Yeah. And I need to be really clear. I'm 69 years old. Certainly by 2026, I'm going to fully retire and spend more time with my grandchildren. And so I'm not arguing for a role for myself in this. And quite frankly, the prospect of 3 more years of the kind of travel I'm doing right now, that's a sacrifice, but it's one I'm willing to make. But I think the Global Methodist Church has to decide what kind of bishops do they want and make the plans for how to select them and fund them. And so I'm trying to help people see the pros and cons of both options.
Is there a sense, like going into General Conference, what that, let's talk about the decision-making process for a second, right? So UMC, if a church is wanting, an annual conference, can submit petitions and legislative proposals. Are we going to be electing delegates to General Conference next year in annual conferences? Are we going to be doing that kind of stuff? Is the Transitional Leadership Council going to bring proposals about these sorts of things? What are the nuts and bolts of how the decision gets made?
Okay. Let's work our way backwards.
Okay.
Sometime in the last 4 months of 2024, there will be a convening General Conference.
Okay.
It will have roughly 350 voting delegates, half clergy and half lay, plus or minus 6%. So somewhere between 330 and 370 voting delegates. The time and the venue are still being determined, but I expect that to be announced relatively soon in the next month or so. Well, back up. That means that delegates need to be elected by each annual conference in the spring, March, April, May, June at the latest. That means that the commission on the General Conference has to decide how many delegates does North Alabama get. And so that information needs to be shared with your conference leadership, so that you know that you get X number of lay and X number of clergy delegates so that you can vote on them sometime in the spring. So I expect to be presiding over a North Alabama annual conference session sometime in March, April, May, June. We'll just have to see how the calendar all fits together. Now, before then, sometime in the spring, there needs to be some proposals authored that are well thought out, that have wide support, so that we spend most of our time at this General Conference in worship and prayer, and as little time as possible in these difficult questions. I think affirming the doctrinal standards of the Global Methodist Church will be easy. Deciding what kind of bishops and how they're elected, that's going to be tougher. So there is a commission on episcopacy, chaired by Jeff Greenway. You heard Jeff lecture brilliantly at your annual conference. And that commission will be bringing some ideas to the Transitional Leadership Council. And the Transitional Leadership Council will forward them to the convening General Conference. However, I'm hopeful that there will be a widespread conversation, and there may be other petitions sent in by people who want to suggest that the Commission on the General Conference's ideas might be strengthened, or there might be another option or something. In other words, we need a robust conversation about the episcopacy, and we want the decision-making done as we want the decisions made at the convening General Conference to be as high quality as possible. One of the big questions is, do we elect more bishops in 2024? Or do we live with just Jones and Webb and any others who come in until the next General Conference, which people are thinking might be in 2026? Again, the church has got to make up its mind what kind of bishops, how many, and how are you going to fund them?
Yeah, that's right. So that's helpful. I think just having a sense of the process is going to be helpful to folks in the GMC, in the pews, to just have more confidence. Like this, we're not going to let it sneak up on us. We're going to have some proposals. Do we expect the Commission on the Episcopacy to give us something at several months ahead of time so that we can have some time to reflect on that?
I hope so.
Yeah, that's going to be important.
Started meeting last week.
Good, good.
or
That's
maybe
helpful.
this. Anyway, I think it was
Yeah.
last week
No,
we
that's
held
very
the
helpful.
first meeting.
Good,
So
good.
yeah, they're at work, and we'll just have to see. But your video interview today is a great contribution to that conversation, because I don't make this decision by myself. I don't want to make it by myself. But I think I have a perspective on what it means to be bishop, both as a historian and as a practicing bishop, that people might find useful as they think it through for themselves.
Yeah, it's been helpful to me. And I mean, I'm willing to go on record and say I think some form of the traveling bishop is going to be our best way forward. I think it's going to help us free bishops up to be shepherds of the church, and help us keep our promise that this will be a mission-oriented, organizationally lean movement. Like the trick is we need enough organizational bureaucracy to serve the church without weighing the church down.
You're exactly right. Now, I do want to help your readers or your listeners understand that the North Alabama pattern of president pro tem and presiding elder is not universal.
Okay, tell us about that.
Are deciding that the president pro tem needs to be a full-time salaried position.
Mm-hmm.
The West Plains Conference not only has a full-time president pro tem, they have 3 presiding elders that are full-time.
Okay.
So each annual conference is living into this new structure with their own levels of funding and structure and personnel. So different conferences are doing it in different ways. But that's your freedom to do. We're not mandating each conference do it the same way. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's helpful to know. I wasn't aware that, or didn't know that they were doing kind of the different models there. I did know, like, we've got a full-time pastor serving as president pro tem. Alabama Emerald Coast has someone who's moving into who's stepping away from the lead role and is going to serve in that, a lead pastor role and is serving. So I knew there were a little variation, but it's helpful to know. But I think it's healthy though, right, to sort of give annual conferences some localized freedom to order themselves as they think will serve them best, without, it's not necessarily the case that there's a cookie cutter approach to this in every region.
Right. And experimentation. You all may find out that somebody's got to be giving more time to this. Right. And the West Plains people may say, wait a minute, we're trying to cut back on our budget, which means we got to do some volunteers or some other kinds of things. Plus, I'll tell you that the Eastern Texas Conference, which covers all of Louisiana and Arkansas, has 52 presiding elders. That's amazing. They're mostly volunteer, given a small stipend, but it means that the circuit presiding elder only has about 6 or 7 churches. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting model. Yep. And we're trying to create, Mark Webb and I are trying to create conversations among presidents pro tem about what's working and what isn't working, so that people can learn from each other about how to do this new denomination. The sort of collaborative experimentation, I think, is a lot of fun. Like, it's encouraging to me to hear people are kind of thinking outside. And I think this, again, helps us say the GMC is not UMC 2.0, because we have annual conferences experimenting with different administrative structures. And that's okay. Like, that's good. We're going to encourage that. There are parts of the United Methodist Church that worked well, that are valuable and need to be preserved. There are parts of the United Methodist Church, and I would lift up general agencies as the sort of prime example, that we don't need to do, and therefore it's baggage we ought to leave behind to be more nimble and mission-focused.
That's tremendously helpful. And I think it's worth, maybe we can punctuate this as we pull the conversation together, that what we're proposing, I think, in terms of traveling Asbury-style bishops, Francis Asbury-style bishops, is not new, that in some ways it's sort of recovering our early identity. The residential bishop model, I heard you say, was kind of an early to mid 1900s innovation. I think you said 1938, 39. And so now we've looked at that. We've seen some of the weaknesses, and we have a chance now in the Global Methodist Church to still live into something that's a part of the Wesleyan tradition, but perhaps has potential to serve us better in the age we're in.
You're exactly right.
Good. Well, thank you so much. As we part, are there any other, so we've talked a lot about bishops. Are there 2 or 3 other major questions that the Global Methodist Church needs to be thinking about going into General Conference?
The biggest question is not related to General Conference. It's about ethnic diversity.
Okay.
When I get to heaven, I expect there to be people from every nation, tribe, language, group, race present. And I'm concerned that in too many places, we are looking too white and too old. We need to figure out how to reach younger people. We need to figure out how to include more people of color. That's an issue that I think we need to be paying attention to, as well as evangelism and church planting and youth ministry. Those are the missional focuses that I really want to get across to people over and over. It's not a General Conference matter. We are diverse, we are global, but we can do a better job in some of our conferences of embodying the diversity of the body of Christ.
Very good. Listeners, viewers, thanks for being a part of this. If you have questions, drop them in the comment threads. We'll take a look at that. And if there's some things that we need to revisit, maybe we'll learn some questions people are asking we haven't heard about already. Bishop Jones, thank you so much for taking the time out this morning to do this interview and offer us some theological leadership and shepherding as we think about this new Methodist movement. Personally, I'm excited about the Global Methodist Church. I'm excited about the future, and I'm grateful for your leadership.
Matt, you're very kind to have given me a platform to talk to people. I just want to share my excitement that I've been praying for the renewal of Methodism since 1988. I'm now living it, and what a blessing it is.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. Thanks so much.